Hello, everyone who has just joined us. Thank you for joining us today on behalf of the conveners team consisting of Melissa Goldstein, Adnan Haida, and myself. A warm welcome to you all joining us today. And these webinars are co-sponsored by the Bioethics Interest Group here at the George Washington University and the Office of Research Excellence in the Milken Institute School of Public Health. They are also co-sponsored by the collaborative research ethics capacity strengthening programs between George Washington University and the University of Science, Techniques, and Technologies of Bamako, USTTB in Mali, University of Zimbabwe, and also the Aga Khan University in Karachi, Pakistan. Today, as the Office of Research Excellence and also as the Bioethics Interest Group, we are hosting 3 IREX fellows who are joining us. 2 they are from the University of Ghana, and 1 is from Stellenbosch University. So they are in the building right now with me, and they are part of this webinar. But we're also hosting our collaborating partner from Mali, Dr. Seydou Dombia, who is visiting us at GW. Welcome, everyone. My name is Paul Ndebele, and I am an assistant director in the Office of Research Excellence. And welcome, Melissa. Thank you for joining.
I'm very happy to be here today and to welcome our 2 guests who are quite well known in their fields, and we're very lucky to have them. Thanks you both.
Thank you. And today we are going to talk about the ethics of animal research, and we've got 2 panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Rebecca Walker, who is a professor in the Department of Philosophy. She's also part of the Center for Bioethics at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We also have one of our own, Dr. David De Gracia, who is an Elton Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Philosophy in the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences here at the George Washington University. I would like to thank our 2 panelists for agreeing to be part of this webinar. So I also want to thank everyone who sent in questions and comments during the registration process. And let me just say that you can also send in your questions and comments using the chat function as the panelists are presenting. Once they're done with their presentations, we're going to get into a question and answer session. So, colleagues, let me now invite our first panelist, Dr. Rebecca Walker, to talk to us about issues relating to ethics in animal research. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So thanks so much for the invitation. Really grateful to be invited, and particularly pleased to be on a panel with David De Grazia, who I've known for quite a while and whose work I've known for even longer, but we've never been on a panel together. So very exciting for me. So I want to kind of give a very brief introduction, sorry, to our topic, and then talk a little bit about oversight and home in on some of the gaps there. So we're talking about animal research, and we might wonder, okay, well, how many animals are actually used in research? That's actually, it turns out, a pretty hard question to answer for a number of reasons. In the US, for example, in 2023, 1.6 million animals were reported by the USDA, but because the Animal Welfare Act doesn't count rats, mice, and birds bred for research who are the animals who are mainly used in biomedical research, that's not a number that's anywhere near accurate. Worldwide, the estimates really depend on the extent to which countries report animal use, and there are some very good estimates out there, but we still don't know exactly. In terms of what kinds of animals are used for research, I've already mentioned rats and mice. There are, of course, many other warm-blooded animals that are also used. There are other vertebrate animals that are used. And then there are non-vertebrate animals that are used as well. And we don't often sort of think about the fruit flies and the nematode worms that are used, and they don't count as animals from a regulatory perspective, but of course they are still animals. Octopus is a more complicated story, as I'll talk about in a minute. What kinds of research are done? Well, here we're really focused on biomedical uses of animals in research, but I wanted to just draw attention to the fact that there are lots of different ways that animals are studied, many of which fall outside of an intervention kind of focus on animals. And when we're talking about biomedical research, non-human animals are really used mainly as models to mimic human disease or disability. So with that under our belt, I want to just acknowledge what we all know, which is that animal research is, of course, controversial from a social point of view. And while many members of the general public support animal research, there are indications that there is declining acceptability of animal research in specific areas over time, as well as lower rates of acceptability for younger respondents. And so now I want to talk a little bit about oversight of animal research. And I'm going to kind of home in on the US perspective. And my apologies to our international guests. I didn't realize it would be such an international audience. So I'm really looking forward to talking about other perspectives outside the US. But I have focused on the US for my presentation. And so in the US, we have some different ways in which animals are overseen in terms of research. We've got the Animal Welfare Act, which is the only federal law that covers animal research and also many other uses of animals. And that's enforced by the US Department of Agriculture. On the other hand, we've got the Public Health Service policy covering animal use, and that really follows the money. So that is covered by the National Institutes of Health for institutions that use Public Health Service Agency funds. Both of those, though, require the use of an institutional animal care and use committee, which has the goals of addressing animal welfare concerns. And they do that by approving protocols and inspecting animal facilities. Now, in addition to these official forms of oversight, you could also get, and this is worldwide, you can get AAA LAC accreditation, which is optional, but which is something that a lot of labs do in order to ensure that their spaces are keeping up with standards. Okay, so now that I've mentioned some of the oversight, and the controversy, I think there is this perspective out there that I want to just address, which is that a lot of folks think, well, okay, animal research is controversial, but we have all of this really important oversight, which is absolutely true. And animal research is really paid very close attention to from a regulatory perspective. So that really should take care of the ethics. Well, there are lots of ethical questions for animal research that are not resolved by oversight. And moreover, oversight doesn't really aim to resolve many of these kinds of questions. So I've listed a bunch here. For lack of time, I'm not going to go through all of them, but just a couple to highlight are, for example, the question of what species should count as animals for the sake of regulatory oversight. We've already seen that there are differences there. Another issue is when it comes to animal death, oversight is really concerned with making sure that animals don't suffer in that process. But we might also ask whether the regular occurrence of animal death is ethically problematic. So when it comes to really homing in on what are the standard ethical principles that are actually used in animal research, we have the 3 R's that were already a part of the sort of introduction to this webinar and are really widely accepted as the ethical principles. And I want to point out that those really fall under, from an ethical point of view, the perspective of an animal welfare concern. But the 3 R's basically are trying to maximize welfare and minimize suffering to animals within the constraints of the science goals and the research setting that we already have in place. So we say, well, we have these science goals that we want to accomplish. How can we make sure that those are accomplished with the least harm being done to the animals that are used in the process? And so the 3 R's again are reduction, refinement, and replacement. And when it comes to reduction, what we're really talking about is using only the number of animals that you actually need for the research that you're trying to accomplish. But there's another question, which is whether we should also be more concerned with making sure that, for example, we aren't doing duplicative studies across institutions. So should we be collaborating more closely with Duke to make sure that we're not using animals for the same purposes that they are? When it comes to refinement, that's really where a lot of the action is in terms of IACUC oversight. People are really focused there on making sure to modify or lessen painful or distressing interventions, again, to the extent possible in keeping with the goals of the science. And then for replacement, there's sort of 2 different ways in which that's understood. The primary way is that you would replace animal models with other methods. But another way of thinking about it that's sometimes brought to bear is the idea that you might, for example, replace a primate model with a mouse model, if that's possible. And so the 3 R's have a lot going for them. They're internationally recognized as an ethical framework for animal research, and so provide a shared starting place. That's really important. And certainly I hope our international visitors will have something to say about that. They are also generally accepted by researchers themselves, and they are homing in on a primary ethical issue, which is animal welfare and harm reduction. At the same time, and we're philosophers, so we're going to focus on the problems. There are a lot of problems for the 3 R's. One problem is there are a lot of different ways to interpret them. I've mentioned some of those already, but there are other, I think, sort of maybe deeper problems. So for example, in a survey that my colleagues and I did of animal researchers, we found that less than a quarter of the people that completed our survey thought that there would ever be a viable alternative to the use of live animals in their field of study. So replacement, which is really important to animal protectionists and to the general public, is something that is not seen as that viable from a scientific point of view. Moreover, almost 80% of the people that we surveyed thought that an emphasis on reduction, either sometimes or often, led to too few animals being used. So you might say, well, it's really important to reduce the number of animals to those needed for the science. But the idea is if you go below the number that are actually needed, you might just be wasting those animals that you do use. And then another slightly more complicated issue is that if you end up trading off, say, a primate model for a mouse model, you might be losing some of that translational value that you really need in order to have the science be valuable in the first place. But from a philosophical perspective, the biggest problem, at least from my point of view with the 3 R's, is that they assume, but they don't account for the moral justification of animal research. So as I said, what we're trying to do is to lessen animal harms and improve welfare given the goals of the science. but we haven't yet justified that we should be using animals for the purposes that we've outlined with the science. So the justification that is usually brought to bear when it comes to animal research in pretty much every guidance or policy document that talks about why we do animal research is really an appeal to benefit. And so that is really the sort of fundamental way in which animal research is typically justified. The problem is that not all benefits are worth their costs. And so, for example, in terms of human subjects research in the US, this is explicitly acknowledged. And institutional review boards are required not just to make sure that those costs or potential risks to subjects are minimized, but also make sure that they're reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits. And again, when it comes to non-human animals, a similar kind of requirement is put forward by the European Union in terms of its directive to animal research oversight. In the US, things are a little bit more tricky because there's really no very clear guidance regarding how or when to balance animal harm and sought after human or other animal benefit. And so there's appeal to scientific relevance and the advancement of knowledge or the good of society, but there's no specific guidance given about how or when to balance those things. In the guide, there is appeal to something that sounds like a harm-benefit analysis. So in certain cases, the IACUC is obliged to weigh the objectives of the study against potential animal welfare concerns. But then the guide goes on to identify the 3 R's as a way forward and not to talk about a harm-benefit analysis. So I am running out of time. I don't have a lot of time for the go through the rest of my slides, but I'm just going to try to summarize sort of what I'm after here. So part of making sure that you bridged subjective risk, subject risk and harm and social value is to make sure that the science that you're doing is good science. So scientific review is a really important part of the harm benefit analysis. And in some other work that I've done with my colleagues, we identified that there are real issues both for human subject and for animal subject research when it comes to how and where that scientific review takes place. Again, for lack of time, I'm not going to go through all of this, but I am going to point to this statement from an IACUC member who confirms what I was saying earlier about there being lack of guidance in terms of animal research. So this person says, I think probably the biggest weakness is we have not been able to sort out the proper role of the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee in their work regarding scientific review. There's still the question of whether it's appropriate or not. There's been almost no guidance on how or what is good practice in that area. So this is my summary slide. Just a brief overview is that I've sort of outlined kind of how the US regulatory approach works in its multiple complexity, some gaps, some benefits to the 3 R's, but also this real issue, which is how we make sure if we appeal to benefit as a reason for causing harm to animals, the necessity of following that through with a harm benefit analysis. So that is my book that's coming out in the summer. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for laying down this very, very good foundation. Now preparing for the next talk by David. So let me now hand over to David.
Okay. I will try to share my screen. Does that work? Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, let me begin by thanking Paul, Melissa, and others for setting up this panel. And you just heard from Dr. Walker about the 3 R's. So I will start with changes in recent decades. And since the publication of the book that presented and proposed the 3 R's that call for an improved framework. Over those decades, there have been growing public concerns about animals, not only in my own country, but I think around the world. There have been advances in the scientific study of animal minds, which I think has the effect of increasing respect for them and more insight into their needs. Animal ethics emerged as a discipline in the 1970s, and since then has exploded in volume and sophistication. There have also, in the last few decades, been increasing concerns in the scientific community about the translation from successful animal studies to clinical use in humans. And around the same time, there have been significant advances in the science of alternatives to using animals. So if a framework is needed, a framework of directive as opposed to really vague ethical principles, what would make such a framework adequate? It would be responsive to the changes I just described. It would be ethically defensible even to professional ethicists. It would be politically reasonable so that it had some chance of uptake. And it would be useful, at least at a general level, to those who are engaged in designing or conducting animal studies. All right, so this is where the late Tom Beecham comes in. Tom Beecham died just last month, unfortunately, and he's in this talk because some years ago he approached me about trying to devise an adequate framework for animal research ethics. And our first product was an article in the ILAR journal listed here, in which we laid out the framework and gave the basic case for it. And then the next year, 2020, our book, Principles of Animal Research Ethics, came out with Oxford. And the book included not just our rather long centerpiece article, but also commentaries by 7 eminent scholars, most of them scientists, including the great and late primatologist Franz de Waal. An important question in animal research ethics is how to deal with all of the disagreement. There's disagreement about how much animals matter, and there's disagreement about how much animal research really confers social benefits. And our strategy was to start with consensus core values. So everyone should be able to agree that the end or goal of social benefit, that which justifies, if anything justifies it, is social benefit. It's not enough just to have to cite scientific curiosity, for example. And everyone should be able to agree that animal welfare sets some limits to the permissible ways of pursuing the goal of social benefit. So this is the structure of the framework we devised. The core value of social benefit supports directive principles that we call no alternative method, expected net benefit, and sufficient value to justify harm. The core value of animal welfare supports principles we call no unnecessary harm, basic needs, and upper limits to harm. So I will walk you through this, if somewhat briskly. No alternative method says, and this is like the R of the 3 R's, use of animal subjects must be the sole ethically acceptable way to address a research problem whose solution offers the prospect of a social benefit. But we think of this as a requirement, not just something to consider. Where this principle is met, a particular animal study offers the prospect of what we can call a unique benefit. But this raises the question, when is this the case? What about alternatives to using animals? Are they a real possibility? Here I'll briefly mention some recent developments that suggest genuine confidence in the prospects for alternatives. In 2019, the US EPA announced that it would reduce, and by 2035 eliminate, testing on all mammals. 2 years later, the European Parliament adopted a resolution to find ways to phase out all animal testing. In 22, in the US again, the FDA finally officially permitted drug makers to use alternatives to animal models. And the next year, an NIH-convened working group report stated that alternatives to the use of animals have great promise even in basic research. And this same report helpfully classified different kinds of alternatives in this way. In silico methods are mathematical models, machine learning, and other computational techniques. Think AI in part. In chemico methods are experiments on biological molecules outside cells, which can be used to study how the molecules interact with drugs or other molecules. And in vitro methods are performed on cells outside the body and involve cell tissues, culture, or organoid techniques. All right, the second principle is called expected net benefit. Some animal studies offer unique benefits. All animal research, like all research, has costs. The principle says the prospect of social benefit from a research study must outweigh its expected costs and risks to human beings. Let me unpack that a little bit. First, with the idea of expected benefit. This is the amount of benefit, if it's achieved, times the likelihood of actually achieving it. Think about it with an analogy. A raffle ticket with a 1 in 25 chance of winning $100 is not itself worth $100. It's worth that divided by 25 minus the cost of the ticket. And this point is obvious, the point that we have to consider likelihood of achieving the sought after benefits. But I think in practice, it's often overlooked or downplayed. And I've noticed that champions of animal research often speak retrospectively, looking backward at successful trials, cherry picking them, without mentioning failed trials or their frequency. But the big picture matters, which brings us to concerns about translation. I was surprised to learn that, now that there have been meta-analyses and systematic reviews of animal studies and how often they translate, that the attrition rate from successful animal studies, not all animal studies, but those that showed that something was safe and effective in animals, the attrition rate appears to be about 90%, which would mean the translation rate from those successful animal studies is about 10%. And a systematic review published in JAMA found that among highly
David is frozen. Rebecca, can you hear him?
No, I think he's frozen. We can maybe send him a message, but I'm not sure what's going on.
Okay, I think you rejoin shortly.
Paul, is it possible to turn off his video? And maybe we can turn to the Q&As that have already been listed until he signs back on. Rebecca, would that be okay?
Yeah, it's certainly fine with me.
Okay, go ahead, Melissa.
So do you see the Q&A?
Yes.
Okay, so there are several here. And I'm not sure if you'd like to address any particular one. So David Curry has asked about the new FDA guidance on heritable intentional genomic alteration. And the first examples of this work involve traits in cattle for better adaptation to tropical climates. And if you have any views on this area of particular animal research.
Yeah, so that would come under some of the other types of research that I listed, like agricultural research, which is something that I'm not as familiar with, but it certainly is an important question about balancing animal welfare concerns, because part of the reason for this type of work is to improve animal welfare, to make the animals that are in tropical climates better able to sustain in those environments, to sustain their lives and to do well. On the other hand, of course, it's possible that some of those animals, in coming up with these animals that are better adapted, there'll be a process of research that will involve harm to some of the animals that are genomically manipulated in this way. So, I think it's a complicated question, and it's, again, in that sort of area of agricultural modification that it's not something I'm as familiar with, but I am familiar with this sort of genomic manipulation and the different kinds of harms and benefits that can come from that. And we have David back.
Yes, I have no idea why that. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Mhm.
I have no idea why that happens. Never happened to me before. I'm going to okay, so I still have share screen. Going back to my PowerPoint. Thank you to the audience for your patience. All right. We had just gotten through this point, and you can still see everything okay? Yeah.
We can't see your slides.
I think you may need to share again, David.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, hold on. Share screen, yes. Okay. How about now?
Uh-huh. Yes, we can
You
see
can
that.
see it? Okay. All right, let me just, okay, we're good?
Yes.
Okay. The third principle of social benefit is sufficient value to justify harm. So suppose that the first two principles have been met. In other words, a proposed animal study offers a unique benefit. There's no viable alternative. And the prospect of this benefit, even taking into account likelihood, exceeds the projected costs to human beings. It doesn't follow that it's ethical, because we have yet to consider the so-called costs to animals. So the principle says, commonsensically, the prospect of a net benefit for human society from a research study must be sufficiently valuable to justify expected harms to animal subjects. And this is somewhat like the EU requirement of an analysis to assess, quote, whether the harm to the animals is justified by the expected outcome, taking into account ethical considerations. Now in addition to those principles of social benefit, there are three of animal welfare. No unnecessary harm says animal subjects must not be harmed unless a particular harm is necessary for and morally justified by scientific purposes. Importantly, the relevant harms are not limited to those caused by scientific procedures. They include harms associated with housing conditions, handling, transport, breeding, anything that affects the quality of life of the animals is relevant. The next principle is called basic needs and says, Animal subjects' basic needs must be met in the conduct of studies unless failure to meet specific basic needs is necessary for, morally justified by scientific purposes. And by basic needs, we mean, Beecham and I mean, what's ordinarily required for a decent life for the kind of animal in question. Here is our proposed list: nutritious food and clean water, safe shelter, adequate stimulation, exercise, and opportunities for species typical functioning, sufficient rest for health, veterinary care as needed, access to compatible conspecifics or social group members, freedom from significant experiential harm or suffering, freedom from disease, injury, disability, freedom of movement with adequate space. And I would ask you to consider how this list and this appeal to basic needs is somewhat similar to the Canadian Council on Animal Care Guideline 2. Animals should be healthy and express species typical behavior. They should neither experience negative affective states, in other words, experiential harm, nor display behavioral signs of chronic anxiety or depression. And finally, upper limits to harm. The principles we've gone through, 5 of them, so far do permit harm whenever necessary for justified scientific objectives, without setting any limits on this harm. And there are no limits built in, at least to the US policy. So all of the following are examples of types of animal research that are and have been approved, or can be and have been approved. Induced terminal heart attacks in dogs, induced third-degree burns and severe lung injury in conscious sheep, learned helplessness induced by inescapable electric shock in rats. The European directive has something very sensible: the performance of procedures that result in severe pain, suffering, or distress that is likely to be long-lasting and can't be ameliorated should be prohibited. They establish an upper limit. But there's no reason to limit it to procedures. For example, a good principle would prohibit desolate housing conditions for monkeys if it would cause them severe long-term suffering. So the way we put it is like this: animal subjects must not be caused to endure severe suffering for a lengthy period of time. Let me close with a few possible advantages of adopting and implementing this 6 principles framework. Seeing common ground in the 2 core values might foster more constructive communication between parties that tend to disagree about animal research. Implementing the principles of social benefit should spur more successful translation, better science. Implementing principles of animal welfare would promote the objective of decent lives for animal subjects, better protection. And better translation and animal welfare could increase public trust for the animal research community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. We are happy that you managed to come back after the small glitch. So now we're going to proceed into the question and answer segment. So thank you to David and also to Rebecca for these great presentations. And thanks also to the participants. There are lots of questions that are coming in. But I just want to start off. I'm going to pose one question, and then we'll then move to Melissa to pose some of the questions as she's going to leave shortly. There is one of the participants here who is saying that in a lot of these animal studies, they mainly favor the use of the male animals. And this participant is actually saying that if you are going to be breeding because you're interested in the males, it actually means then you end up with the non-usage of the female animals. So the question is, if these studies are to be translatable to humans, shouldn't the researchers use both sexes in their research? Let's hear
Yes.
from Rebecca, and then we'll move to David.
Yeah, and in fact, that's been a hot area of discussion lately. A while ago, the NIH created a policy on this. So for the US context, at least, there's a policy on sex as a biological variable in animal research that really homes in on this issue of translation and the necessity of using female in addition to male animals. It's turned out, I think, to be a little bit more complicated in terms of getting adoption of it, in terms of understanding. So, for example, there's been confusion around questions like, does that mean we need to use more animals or just design our research differently? So there was the potential for conflict with the idea of reduction, right? Does that mean we need to use twice as many animals? That's not really the case. And so that's been sort of an education point on this issue. And then for studies, for example, like primate studies, where you might use only one animal, for example, there's really a kind of a problem with using more animals that are of such a highly sensitive species. So I think it's complicated, but yes.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yes, David, any thoughts?
I agree with everything Rebecca said. I would just add that while a necessary condition for having a good model is sort of gender balance, or if I'm not allowed to say gender anymore, biological sex balance, it's not sufficient for having a good model. And I mean, it's interesting to note that the most commonly used animals in research are rodents. For a bunch of reasons. They're a lot easier to use than dogs and monkeys, for example, and less expensive. They don't live as long. But there's been a lot of difficulty translating from rodent models to the human situation. So we want to keep our eye on the quality of the model in all of its respects.
Thank you. Melissa?
Thanks, Paul. And I apologize that I have to leave in a few minutes to go teach a class, but I did want to point out one question and add my own little bit to it in the chat, which is about diverse guidelines. So in this question is about guidelines from USDA, NIH, American Society of Mammalogists for humane use of animals in research, and also specific ones from universities and institutions. And my own question, from my own ignorance, is whether or not individual US states have popped up with more restrictive models, which could be used even with federal law, as long as it's more restrictive, I'm assuming, and possibly private research that is not held to basically the public health service funding. And that individual, like, are there things that are boiling up that may actually ultimately become federal research restrictions and law? Anyone?
Yeah,
David, go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, states may impose restrictions beyond others that are imposed by either, by the federal government, PHS, or the like. I don't know how many states actually do that. That would be a very interesting thing to find out more about. You also asked whether there are certain issues that are bubbling up for the possibility of further restrictions. I mean, it's very, very interesting to me that now the translation crisis finally in the 2020s, it's being taken seriously. And there was the NIH convened panel that really started looking hard at alternatives. So that's a very interesting development. In terms of particular kinds of research or particular research animals, there was controversy a few years ago about the Veteran Administration's use of dogs. And so there was Institute of Medicine, or yeah, I think Institute of Medicine, a study of this and possible alternatives. And it, on the one hand, it denied that use of dogs just wasn't necessary at all. On the other hand, it did acknowledge more alternatives than was common in the past. If there's going to be a change in the next 5 years, I would guess it would involve primates. That's just a guess, just because there's a lot of public concern about the use of, and mainly it's monkeys rather than apes that are used. But there are a lot of concern about that. Rebecca, you might have more specific information about some of these matters. I don't know.
I don't really have specific comments about the state level law issue, but I do want to just kind of home in on what I think is the big picture issue, which is that researchers and labs experience a lot of what they call regulatory burden, right? So they spend most of their time, according to them at least, filling out, sort of, on the one hand, applying for grants, and on the other hand, sort of managing the regulatory aspects of the use of their animals. And so I think from the point of view of researchers, the idea that, enough already, right? So what's really important in all of these different regulations is what's the extent to which it actually improves animal welfare, right? So some of the regulations are things like, you have to keep the laboratory at a certain humidity point. And then if it's off, you have to have an explanation for why that's the case. And you have to check the animals to make sure that they're doing well. But the really important point is, what's the relationship between the humidity and how well the animal's doing? Not all of these sort of, superfluous aspects of that regulatory burden. So I think that's what we should be focused on, is how can we manage regulations in a way that actually achieve the goal, which is to make animals better off.
Thank you both. And as a lawyer, I'm duly chastised about regulatory burden, but yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Thank you. There is one participant who has asked about the connection between the One Health approach and the ethics of animal research. So what are your comments? Rebecca?
I'll just start with a big picture. So I think, the impetus for the One Health movement really did come from direct concern for environmental and animal health as part of how we consider what really matters in terms of taking care of global health. So I think that was really the impetus for thinking about the One Health movement. In some ways, I think it's been sort of problematically turned into a more instrumental approach to thinking about environmental and animal health, because there's been so much focus on zoonotic disease, for example. And there, the idea is really we want to control the animal vectors that are leading to poor human health outcomes. So I think it's really important to kind of to differentiate between One Health in the sense of we want to make animals and the environment healthier because it's good for our health, which is of course very important, but then also saying it also matters because the health of the planet as a whole is valuable in all of its sort of manifestations. So that's just sort of a big picture response to that.
Thank you. David?
I think Dr. Walker nailed that answer, and I have nothing useful to add.
Right. So I'll come back to you, David, now and say there's someone who is actually proposing the 5 R's. So in addition to those three, thinking about responsibility and respect. And this participant is also asking where we would place rehoming.
Great. I like all those R's. I think respect for animals requires substantively adequate principles for their involvement in research. And we have the responsibility to make this happen. So I sort of cheerfully endorse those R's and then humbly suggest that in our imperfect world, in which there's a lot of disagreement about these matters, that something like the 6 principles framework that Tom Beecham and I have proposed.
Oh, he's frozen again. I think he's having some bandwidth issues.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Well, let's wait till he gets back on. But in the meantime, in terms of the R's, I think this is a really interesting exercise because people are constantly coming up with additional R's. I've heard so many. I've heard remembering to sort of pay homage to the animals that have been used in research. I've heard relationship, to pay attention to how we relate to animals and to human-animal bonds. So I love people coming up with more R's that really reflect on how we might expand our consideration of animals.
Thank you so much. There are several participants here who are from outside the US, and some of them have been sending questions related to the state of animal research ethics, especially in Africa and also in Asia. So what are some of your comments with regards to the state of animal research ethics in different parts of the world? Welcome back, David.
Yes.
You are muted.
So we moved on from the previous question, which I was starting to answer when I lost the connection again. So sorry. Should I finish that answer or go
Yes.
to the, okay. All right. What I was going to say was that arguably one basic need of animals is freedom from premature death, not dying when continuing life would be worthwhile for the animal. I think that's correct. I think it's incredibly complicated for how to think about that. And I don't assume that, for example, a mouse loses as much from premature death as a person would. But I do think it's something to consider. And this makes rehoming relevant. And I think that rehoming, especially those animals who serve as research subjects and seem to have an awareness of their lives as, continuing over time, their continued life could be valuable if they're treated well. And so I think what this calls for is reversing the presumption that at the end of studies, animals will be killed. This is a big deal, and it could be very expensive and difficult, but I think there is a moral cost to ending the life of an animal prematurely. Now, some animals, because of what they're involved in, it's not in their interest to continue to be alive. But I think in a lot of cases, animals are sacrificed or killed at the end of studies, and the term euthanasia is used incorrectly in those cases because it's not for the animal's benefit that their lives end, but for the benefit of those who would otherwise have to take care of them. So anyway, I want to sort of give a shout out for serious consideration of that 6th R, rehoming. And now you have this good question I heard about half of about animal research ethics around the world. Rebecca, would you take first stab at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, comparing especially oversight models is really interesting from an ethical point of view, especially so, for example, the models that I'm most familiar with are in the US and in the European Union. And so comparing those two models, for example, you have one issue that David has already brought up, which is that in the European Union, you have an upper limit on harms that are allowed to animals. Now, as it turns out in practice, I think that doesn't really impose as much of a limit as you might have thought. So there are many things that you might categorize from our point of view as pretty severe pains and harms that would still be allowable. But at least in principle, there's an idea of an upper limit. Also in the European Union, there is a requirement for harm benefit analyses, which, as I was talking about, we have a little bit of a hard time locating exactly where and how that should happen in the US. And then, it's really interesting to think about other models where it's really hard, for me at least, to get good information about what kind of oversight is functioning. So, for example, I've been really interested in finding out more about what's happening in China from a research oversight perspective. And I really haven't gotten as much good information as I'd like to have because, for example, they've started using a lot more non-human primates as it's become more difficult to do some of that kind of research in the European Union in particular, and to some extent here. So I think it's a great question, and I love it as a topic, and I wish that I knew more about different models around the world.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'll just try and respond to that based on my own experience working in different parts of the world, and say that in some of the countries, they actually do not have the necessary structures for protecting animals in both research and also in teaching. But in most of the countries, they have the societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals as a starting point. And at times, some of the officials have actually gone into academic institutions to check on how they are doing with animals. But also to emphasize that at the international level, we've got the CIOM's guidelines on the usage of animals. So that's a guidance document that can be adopted by people from all over the world. But additionally, colleagues in different countries can also learn from our own environment here and try and look at the various structures that we have, including also even the application forms that are being used that they can adopt for their own settings. So this is just from my own interactions with researchers involved in animal research. So let me take this time to thank Rebecca and David for those excellent talks and also for responding to all these questions. So now let me give each of you some 30-40 seconds in parting shots. Let's start off with David.
Well, I just got cut off again and got back on. It's a very strange thing. It may be, I happen to be visiting right now at NIH, and there is an extra layer of something that may account for why I keep getting cut off and have to sign on. Parting thought, this relates to the previous question. I'd like to note that one thing that the European Union does, which I think is a good thing, is they've decided that with very few exceptions, you can't do invasive research on great apes at all. In the US, we made this move with regard to chimpanzees, but they've gone a little farther. And I think for reasons that would be complicated to get into now about concerning moral status, that there's a very good case for not using great apes at all in invasive research. I just wanted to note that. I also wanted to note or express the view that it's really important to try to step out of a kind of tribal political affiliation in considering this issue, and to try to find common ground as much as possible so that exchanges of ideas can be thoughtful and respectful and well-informed. And that makes progress possible, I think, without it alienating one's so-called opponents. I just wanted to put in a pitch for that. I think it's really important. I think it's possible and maybe beginning to happen.
Thank you, Rebecca. Your parting shots?
I want to take up on what David just said, because I think that one of the ways in which you see the problem with the polarizing views is precisely with respect to this rehoming animals issue that was raised, because laboratories do not advertise animals that are available for rehoming to a broader public because they're concerned about backlash that they will get on the studies that they're performing. So they're really relying only on the internal vet techs to continuously take up animals that are available for rehoming. So that's really a way in which we could all benefit from trying to have a more decent civil discussion about this topic. And thank you for providing the opportunity for doing that.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you so much, David, for taking time to talk to us today about issues that relate to the ethics of animal research. So let me just take a few seconds just to give a few administrative announcements on some of the activities that we are going to engage in during the coming days. Just give me a second just to share this. Okay. All right. So with our next internal meeting, we're actually focusing on clinical ethics consultation service. And we're going to have Del Lupu, who is going to talk to us. So this is basically a GW internal meeting where we have people meeting in person, and then, of course, a few attending online. But let me also just emphasize for our internal audience, our Research Day 2025 is going to be on the 16th of April. Lots of students are already submitting their abstracts for this event. Let me also talk about our Summer Institute that's going to be held from June 2nd up to the 13th. And we're running a course on responsible conduct of research and another one on ethics in public health practice and policy, in addition to 8 other courses. So colleagues, even those from outside GW, are most welcome to attend. Let me take this opportunity to thank everyone who has participated in this webinar. And let me just also say, for our GW students, they can submit their professional enhancement activity forms through the GW SPH big email address for signature. Once again, thanks everyone for participating, and special thanks to our panelists, Rebecca and David. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Paul.
you.